Welcome to another episode of Time to Talk Fraud. This is a very special episode because today we're talking about medical fraud and some of the things around medical fraud. And I'm really pleased, I'm genuinely quite excited to say we're joined by a couple of members of the NHS Counter Fraud team in Ian and Alex. Guys, welcome to the pod. I don't know whether you want to give just a quick introduction about yourselves.
My name's Alex Rothwell. I am the Chief Executive of the NHS Counter Fraud Authority. Thank you very much for having us on the show.
I'm Ian Henderson. I'm the Social Media Officer for the NHSCFA since we sort of formed about 5 years ago now, I think we are.
The NHS is the UK's publicly funded healthcare service. It's a big deal in the UK. In many sort of polls and things like that, it's often ranked as the thing that makes you most proud to be British. I mean, that's how important it is to not just our medical side of things, but society as well in this country. So this is really exciting for us to talk through this. Very quickly, I guess, a lot of people are not sure probably that there is even fraud going on in the NHS. It's a public service, mostly thought of as doctors and nurses and all of those sort of things. So are there any sort of headlines that you can give us with regard to what fraud actually exists?
We estimate that our vulnerability to fraud is around about £1.4 billion.
So who's targeting this fund? I mean, 1.4 billion is an awful lot going around.
So I would say, broadly speaking, what we've done is we've categorised different types of fraud. What we're looking at are things like procurement, commissioning. So this is primarily things involving bribery, collusion, corruption, that sort of thing. False claims for services provided. So it's not all about internal fraud. It's not all about staff committing fraud. This is people seeking to get things like services for free. That could be medication. It could be treatment. Or as I say, it could just be services. We do have staff fraud. It's an enormous employer. So things like income, expenses, pensions, opportunities to get bursaries, that sort of thing. We get compensation claims. That's another area that we see quite a bit of. And of course, the NHS is a government-funded body. We get some pretty complex areas relating to how payments are made to providers based on performance and contractual obligations and that sort of thing. But I'm really keen to point out here, I think there's a danger here that this function has a sort of, a kind of internal affairs feel about it. Yes, we recognise that in a large organisation there are opportunities to defraud it. But as I say, it's not all about employees. There are lots of companies and individuals that engage with the NHS. And when you've got such a big budget, it's a target for fraudsters. Let's face it, as are other government departments. That's very well documented. But I'm really keen to sort of make the point that we want to work to create a culture and an environment where fraud is prevented from happening rather than one where we are predominantly detecting and investigating. We want to create an environment where it's harder to actually commit fraud in the first place. We know that fraud is the most prevalent crime in the UK, but it's really underreported and it's only identified if you find it. It's not always the sort of thing that, it's not like if you get burgled, you instantly know when you get home that stuff has gone missing. Or we think we know the extent and scale of it. It often doesn't receive funding that's commensurate with the scale of the challenge.
How do you keep that communication between all of those parts? Because we're not talking about doctors potentially committing fraud. We might be talking about someone that's in an office that you wouldn't even necessarily think of working with the NHS.
So there are over 200 clinical commissioning groups currently that are responsible for identifying local needs, and they plan and buy local healthcare for local areas. And they'll commission services locally. And there are some centralised functions as well. Now that's actually going to change, and this might help us a little bit because this summer we expect those commissioning groups to be reduced to 42 in total. And they're going to be called integrated care boards. So that is an opportunity for us to sort of slim down the challenge, if you like, of stakeholder engagement. The premise of that broad work, if you like, with the commissioning groups and trusts in particular, is that each organisation is obligated to have a local counter-fraud specialist, accredited people who are trained to manage fraud in particularly in a public sector environment, and will work with the trusts and commissioning groups to conduct risk assessments, proactive exercises, advise on fraud, help with messaging, and investigate cases. That's a key part of how that service is delivered. Our role in the National Counter Fraud Authority is to provide leadership and coordination of that function. Now, to answer your question, how do you engage these with such a sort of complex environment? I am absolutely committed to the concept of having a counter fraud community. There's actually a global counter fraud community. I've been working in counter fraud for some time, and I've met people all over the world who are absolutely passionate about dealing with fraud. And I think just that in itself, belonging to that community, is something that we can all capitalise on.
With your talks about prevention as well, does that mean you're looking at the reasons why people might be committing fraud against or in the NHS and starting to discuss that from that level?
I think the big thing for me is you need to understand what the enablers of fraud are. We could easily have zero fraud, but we couldn't then easily live our lives and go about our business or have innovative financial solutions or, quite frankly, be able to do very much with this incredible technology that we have at our disposal. So we always recognise that there is a balance and a trade-off in any environment. And I'm not talking specifically about the NHS here. There's a trade-off in determining what your tolerance to fraud is. I think sometimes the thing that gets lost is the impact of when fraud occurs. And I've seen this firsthand in a law enforcement environment. We've moved from a situation perhaps 10 or 15 years ago where fraud was fundamentally seen as something that only really happened in companies or businesses to something that now affects millions of citizens, and the personal impact that can have on individuals. I've seen firsthand. I remember a incredibly moving video that a fraud prevention officer had taken a few years ago of a gentleman who'd lost his life savings, and he had grown up as a child in the war and had survived the Blitz, but his house had been destroyed, every single thing in it. And he compared the impact of this fraud to the day when he came home and found that his entire house had been destroyed and there was nothing left. So it was really, moving. Understanding the enablers is critical, because then you can start to focus on, the things that you need to address to make it harder. And there are business decisions to be made there as well.
One of your points as well was about cutting all fraud. I mean, we can reflect that on our side. We can cut all fraud, just stop all card payments. It doesn't solve everything, but it is that payoff. And like you say, it's a business at the end of the day.
One of the biggest shifts that we've seen, I would say, over the last 10 years or so is that digitalisation of services and the way that you can reach into people's lives through communication technology. Massive changes. There isn't a single solution. And, we spoke about sort of tackling enablers. You often hear the phrase in the fraud environment, you can't investigate your way out of fraud. Prevention is absolutely the most effective way to address it. Let's stop it happening. We know that criminals and criminal organisations often don't care about the sort of things that we're talking about here. They wouldn't be criminals in the first place if they did, quite frankly. But there is a spectrum, isn't there? And I recognise that. So I think, and we do a lot of messaging, and our current campaign that's in development is along the lines of, are you bothered? Are you bothered that this is taking money away from key services that are being delivered? Ian, I know you wanted to come in.
Yeah, I was just going to sort of back you up on that and say that some of our messaging, if you look back from the very early days, we've used things like, do you know NHS fraud costs sort of the equivalent of 5,000 ambulances or about 40,000 staff nurses and things like that. Yeah, I think this is the trouble. We are dealing with, there are criminals of different scopes. Some sort of may dabble and sort of think, we're only claiming, let's say, £100 off something, from a particular fraud. Others will be going much bigger. And I think the trouble is they don't see it as potentially it's money owned by an individual, because if you look at it where it is owned by an individual, as in a romance fraud, they will say anything to get the money off somewhat a lonely person and literally break their hearts, which then does ironically link to us because they often come to the NHS for care, be it mental health or well-being. So yeah, it is. I'd love to get more messages personally to the fraudsters and what motivates people. Some of the cases we've had in the past, one recently was motivated by gambling. They stole from the NHS to fund their gambling. And you're thinking, okay, well, is there something, where did that go wrong? Where could we have put, or the trust or the organisation could have put safety things in, say, look, you need to seek help. You've got a gambling problem. Don't steal from the NHS. That will not help you at all. It's going to make your situation worse. So yeah, we do sometimes direct our messaging to them. It's just, it is difficult because I'm not sure some of them have enough heart to actually care, because we also go on the other side and say, well, you do realise if you do get found guilty, you go to prison. We will come after your pensions. We can look at these things. You can lose your professional standing if you are an internal member of staff with a qualification. We can literally sort of, once you've been caught, but prevention is better than cure. So that's the thing, and it's very appropriate to the NHS, really.
And I think in any organisation where there are where there is a significant amount of money in the system, will be vulnerable to fraud, and that's why we say there will always be fraud.
Hypothetically, and I'll stress hypothetically here, of course, how would you guys commit fraud? What would be your go-to? Just so we can cross that off and let people know if they want to commit it. We already know how it's done.
There is no way I am going to sit here and tell you how to commit fraud against the NHS. So to sort of flip your question around a little bit, one thing that we think is critical is that whenever a new policy or process is introduced, it should always have a fraud risk assessment associated with it. What's the likelihood of fraud happening? Because and it's not necessarily going to be overnight, because as people start to find out a bit, people will test those vulnerabilities, and they'll keep testing, and they'll learn from others, they'll share information, they'll collaborate, just doing all of the things that we like to do till they get to a point where they can exploit the vulnerability effectively. Yeah. And then we start to close off the vulnerability, and then they're looking for something else. So it's a continuous process, isn't it?
It is a great question in a way, because I must admit, when we're doing presentations and things, I'll often say to people who are not from a fraud background, and say, okay, imagine your house or flat, and say, you're locked out, how do you get in? And they usually come, oh yeah, I'd do this, I'd climb on the bin at the back and you open the small window. And you go, right, here's a thought. When you go home, why don't you lock that window, put some locks on it, put lights on or whatever.
Or don't leave the bin out the back.
That's it, yeah, absolutely. And they translate it then. Oh, right. So if you're putting in, as Alex has just said, a new policy or whatever, take that to pieces. Find the weaknesses before you implement it, and then hopefully no problems, so no fraud or, whatever you're looking for, bribery or corruption, which obviously are the other things we look for. So yeah, absolutely. Just sit calmly and get people in, that are specialists. Don't pretend to be a fraud expert. No, I'm not sure there is such a thing, because fraud is so dynamic. It changes. Yeah, just stop for a moment and take a close look at it under a microscope.
Definitely. And that's the point of what we're trying to achieve, all of us in our respective roles. And what we're trying to do is to get people to think about it themselves, to get them to take those perspectives and think about how they can help on an individual level and on a business level to prevent these things from ever happening.
And we've got 1 million pairs of eyes in the NHS. Our staff is that, so we're just trying to train their eyes up now, so they'll look for these things as well.
There's places to report this.
We can either sort of point people to their local counter fraud specialists. They can speak to them directly if they want to do it face to face. Usually they just need to get hold of them. They can do it through our Crime Stoppers number, which is 0800 028 4060. And obviously it's free phone and 24/7, or yeah, absolutely look for the report fraud button on our website, and that'll track us down as well.
Amazing. Thank you for that, and thank you so much for joining us today. So,
Pleasure.
As said, there's places to report this. CFA.nhs.uk is the website for the Counter Fraud Authority if anyone wants to go. Ian, is there anywhere else people can get hold of you guys particularly?
Well, we've got Facebook and Twitter we've had for a while, and we've now just set up an Instagram account as well. So we're sort of, like I say, that's part of the education process, really, just to say. And we're very keen on sharing other agencies as well. So you'll see things on there. Obviously, cyber's a big threat at the moment, not just to the NHS, but to everybody. So yeah, we also do generic sort of fraud prevention advice as well. So, yeah, come and find us online.
And internally, Ian, NHS staff can speak to their local counter fraud specialist.
Absolutely, yeah. We really encourage that because it's doing it over a phone to anybody really, yeah. But if you can, just chat to your LCFS as they call them. That's the acronyms. We work for the NHS. There's shed loads of acronyms, so we will try. We've done well today, I think, not to use many, but yeah, local counter fraud specialist, and they can sort of, like say, they'll answer a lot of questions for them.
Amazing. Thank you very much. And for other listeners, if you want to contact myself, Amy or Yaz, you can find us on LinkedIn or Twitter at the AI Corporation, hashtag TTTF, and you can also contact us at timetotalkfraud@aicorporation.com. Thank you very much, everyone.